this lady, decided to go to Taiwan. What for? Why do you go to Taiwan? He went to Taiwan to provoke China. They promote war because among the biggest arms producers, the biggest traders in arms was America. All the countries must be democratic. If you are not democratic, they are prepared to even invade your country. Now, during World War, they worked with the Russians. But the moment they won the war against Germany, they said the new enemy is Russia. That was their partner.
Media Mundo.
I'm here in Kuala Lumpur with Tun Mahathir Mohamad. We're going to talk about Malaysia, the history of Malaysia and the current place in the world, and also about the Kuala Lumpur Tribunal, the War Crimes Tribunal that you set up. I think that first we could go back to the history a little bit to give us some insight in. From the Netherlands, Malaysia is far away. Can you? I just curious, how different is Malaysia of today that the Malaysia that you grew up in still under the British occupation at that time? Can you give us some perspective how that was economically, politically?
Malaysia was occupied. The peninsula was occupied by people of Malay race. Most of them came from Sumatra, where there is an area that is peopled by Malays. Their language, their culture is Malay. And for a long time, they have been coming to the peninsula. And in the peninsula, they set up small states, not a whole country, but small states, and there were very many states in the peninsula. The states, they occupied the peninsula from the Isthmus of Kra to the Rio Archipelago, south of Singapore. And these states, they were absolute monarchies, where the ruler, the Raja, is above the law and can do anything because no action can be taken against him.
And this is before colonization. You're talking about
before. Yeah. When they came to Malaysia, they set up the small states, and these small states were monarchies, absolute monarchies. But because they were small, they were not strong. And they were surrounded by big countries which impose conditions on the Malays. For example, in the north there's Thailand, at that time known as Siam. Yeah. Siam was a big country, and the Malay states, in order to remain independent, they send tokens of being under the rule, under the power of Siam. They send every year gold and silver flowers. It's a token that they were vassal. You see, so, and they were able to thrive, always subject to invasion by surrounding powerful countries. And then, of course, they came into contact with the Europeans. The first European to come to the peninsula were the Portuguese. They came to the state of Malacca. Malacca at that time was a very prosperous state. It was a trading port for a lot of trade between east and west. You see, and because of the monsoon, sometimes the traders need to make a stop in Malacca, stay in Malacca for about 6 months, waiting for the winds to change. But in 1509, the Portuguese came, and the Malays treated them as foreigners, and of course it seems that some of them committed some crimes, and they were punished. And the Portuguese went back to Portugal. They organized a very big fleet of ships, of warships, with soldiers and all that. And they came back to Malacca in 1511. Then they attacked the state of Malacca, and they defeated the state. So the Portuguese occupied Malacca. The Malacca Sultanate had to move south into another state. But for 100 years almost, the Portuguese ruled Malacca. And then they were lost to the Dutch. The Dutch people came, and they were conquering all the islands of the peninsula, of the archipelago, including Malacca. So Malacca came under Dutch rule. Then the Holland had a war with Britain in Europe, and Holland lost to Europe, and as a result of that, there was an agreement for Malacca to be given to the British in exchange for Batavia or Batawi, now called Jakarta, was given to the Dutch. So Malaysia experienced British colonialism, beginning with Malacca. Subsequently, they bought land in the peninsula, including Penang, set up trading stations. But because they were able to administer the area that they have colonized well, became prosperous, the Malay rulers were impressed, and they wanted to copy the British style of administration. So they decided to employ British advisors. The British advisors were supposed to advise, but the British advisors took over the states as if they had colonized the state. And then it became British Malaya. Of course, during the Bangkok Treaty of 1909, the British handed over 4 Malay states to Siam. The rest of the peninsula became part of the British territories.
Yeah, and so this is, I think, very concise overview of the history, how the Europeans came in. But I think, as we know, the colonial empires always took a lot of things, resources, to enrich themselves. So can we say that also under the Portuguese, British, and the Dutch as well, that Malaysia was, that the resources went away, or went to Europe to enrich Europe?
Well, Malaysia is at the crossroad between East and West. All the trade, in those days, goods are transported by ships, and ships have got to be supplied with food and water, and normally they do that in Malaysia, in Malacca in fact. So after the Portuguese occupied Malacca, of course Malacca was ruled as a Portuguese colony. Subsequently, the Dutch took over. Again, it became a Dutch colony. And the trading went on, and later on, after the Treaty of Utrecht, where the Dutch lost to Britain, many of the Dutch territories were transferred to the British, and among them was Malacca. So the British came into Malacca.
But what was the goal? You say it's only to, as a station to water the ships, or did they, like in Indonesia, they were after the spices and so many things. Here as well, I suppose.
Malaysia also has got some land, but initially they were focused on trading, on becoming a supply base for the ships going east or west. They stopped there. It was only much later that the British discovered rubber in Brazil. And Brazil climate is the same as in Malaysia. So the British started planting the rubber tree first in Kew Gardens in London. And from there, the rubber tree was transferred to Malaysia and was planted in Malaysia, and it did very well. After that, the British realized that the demand for rubber was growing as more and more vehicles began to use rubber for their tires. So the British realized that Malaysia offered land that can produce a lot of rubber.
And then the plantations came. Yeah.
So they started big estates, taking from Malaysia big pieces of land. 25,000 acres were taken by British companies. At that time, the British were ruling Malaysia, and they paid very little. They paid only about $5 per acre, and they took huge pieces of land, and they planted the land with rubber trees, and they were doing very well because the demand for rubber was increasing as motor vehicles, new motor vehicles are produced, and most of the transportation use motor vehicles which has rubber tires.
So then Malaysia became part in this industrial big machine, this industrial capitalist system. Already in your time, I mean, when you were born in 1925, right? A very long time ago, almost a century. How can you explain us a little bit about what this meant for the hierarchy in this colonial state? Because I know I'm a historian, I studied Indonesia, there was a 3-layered apartheid system, 3 different systems of law. And then, of course, the biggest majority of Indonesians had no rights. How was that here? How were the Malaysians positioned?
Well, in Malaysia, the locals do not cultivate in order to give part of their produce to the colonial masters. That happened in Indonesia. In Malaysia, the focus was more on acquiring land for rubber estates. And the rubber estate belonged wholly to the British companies and some other European companies. So they were doing very well with rubber because the demand kept on increasing with the greater use of motor vehicles. And when the war between China and America was fought in Korea, the demand for rubber grew. But after that, of course, there was a collapse in the rubber market, and a lot of people suffered. But the rubber industry was started by the British, but they bring in workers from India. So a lot of Indians came to Malaysia.
Still quite a big minority group until today, therefore.
But they came here to work, and they were supposed to go back to India after they finished their contract. But they did not want to go back to India because life was good here, so they want to stay here. So many Indians stayed here. Some went back. Also, the British wanted supporting economy to supply the British business people with all their needs. For that, they allowed the Chinese to come in. The Chinese were very good at setting up retail shops and providing all the needs of the estates were supplied by the Chinese. So Malaysia, which at one time was peopled only by Malays, has now become multiracial.
Yeah.
We have Indians who work in the estates, and we have the Chinese who set up many towns because they were the retailers and also the wholesale suppliers of the needs of the British companies.
Okay. Yeah, I think maybe we can also move a little bit to more recent times, the time that you became Prime Minister the first time for a very long period, and also a second time again in 2018, right? But in this first period, in the, let's say, in the 1960s, you came into politics, and then in 1969 there was this racial conflict, and there were a lot of things going on. I would like to know first more about how did Malaysia deal with, the British were officially not the colonizers anymore, but they were still in other ways maybe present or influential. How to deal with that? How did you face that?
When the British treated the Malay states as their colonies, they ruled the country. The locals have no say, although they may be employed by the government, but they had no say in the policies of Malaysia. So the British brought in Indians and Chinese. Very soon, we find that the Chinese are doing very well. They became very rich. They began to buy land from the Malays. And by the time I became Prime Minister, the country, the people in the country were of three different races, but the most successful people were the Chinese. They were very rich. They owned small estates. They owned all the retail business, all the wholesale business. They were also in imports and exports. But of course, the British limited them. Most of the big business were controlled by British companies. Only small business were given to the Chinese.
So can we say that there is also a hierarchy? So even though the Chinese were maybe more, in terms of economics, more powerful and wealthy than the majority of Malay, on top always the white man, the British, that takes everything from. Is that?
British policy is not written, but practice. For example, all big business like import-export houses, like shipping, transportation, estates, mining, all the big ones were taken by the British. The Chinese cannot go into the big ones. So the British excluded the Chinese. So they were in a way obstructed by the British because of a policy which was not written. But because the government was run by the British, they worked for the British.
And this is still, are you talking about before independence? But when you, later on, you were, how did you fight it? Because you're known to be very pro-Malay and helped, to help them to get higher up. How did you manage to do that?
When we gained independence, all the British policies were thrown out. In other words, we allow Chinese, Indians, and Malays, if they want to go into the big businesses. Eventually, the Chinese were able to buy up all the British companies, all the British estates, and they became extremely rich because during independence there is no restriction. Anybody can go into any business, and the Chinese, being very good in business, they benefited the most. So by the time I became Prime Minister, there is a big gap in terms of wealth between the Chinese, the Malays, and the Indians. The Chinese were the richest people. The Malays were largely poor people, but most of the administration is in the hands of the Malays. And the Malays, at the time of independence, believed that they would always rule the country because they were in the majority. They thought that it's all right, the economy can be handled by the Chinese, they can become rich, but political power would remain with the Malays. But by the time I became Prime Minister, the Chinese were so rich that they were buying up all Malay land. And the gap between the Chinese and the Malays in terms of wealth began to increase very much. And this is not fair, of course. We should share the wealth of the country between all the races. But because the Chinese were very smart in business, they gained the most. So because of that, there was bad feelings between Malays and the Chinese in particular. And before I became Prime Minister also, there was an outbreak of racial war in 1969. I became Member of Parliament in 1964. In 1969, I again stood for election. But because the Chinese refused to support me, I lost. I stopped becoming Member of Parliament. And of course...
so you met your approach and what you said, because you also wrote in 1970, right? The Malay Dilemma, the famous book. You met resistance a lot, I assume. Yeah.
Well, the government was not happy with me because I pointed out the disparity in the wealth of the different races. And I pointed out to the government that the reason for the race riots was because of this disparity. And of course the government was not happy with me. I was expelled from the party. And for a time I was out of politics almost entirely. But subsequently, the head of government, the Prime Minister, changed. The first Prime Minister, Tun Mahathir Mohamad, was a very easygoing person. He doesn't mind to see the Chinese doing well and all that. But the people in the rural areas, the Malays, were very poor. So this gap kept on increasing. So there was this 1969 race riots, and because of that, the government could not be formed because the support for the government for the main party has been reduced. This is a Malay party, but there was a declaration of a state of emergency. Actually, Parliament was suspended, and the country was ruled by an organization called National Operations Council, NOC, National Operation Council, or Mageran in Malay. And it was headed by Tun Abdul Razak, the Deputy Prime Minister. The Prime Minister himself left the administration to Tun Razak. Tun Razak realized that the disparity in wealth between Malays and Chinese would become worse and would lead to more race riots. So he introduced the new economic policy. A new economic policy is directed at trying to help the Malays catch up with the Chinese in terms of acquisition of wealth.
Can I ask you more to focus also on how the neo-colonial way of still trying to get something from Malaysia, how that, because you introduced a new policy, the Look East policy. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that is maybe interesting for our viewers who try to understand Malaysia, and also how all these newly independent countries still had to struggle.
Yeah. When we became independent, we got rid of the policies of the colonial masters. We want the business to be done by everybody without any restriction. But we find that world economy was controlled by the Europeans, and they determined the prices of products and all that. In fact, the market was in London. Although we were the biggest producer of rubber and tin, the market was in London. The companies were registered in London. They were making money here, but they were not paying tax here. They were paying tax in London. Yeah. So this was not good for Malaysia. Of course, Sukarno also felt the same thing. He introduced the word neo-colonialism, because although Indonesia became independent like Malaysia, but economy-wise, the European powers, the Dutch and the British, still control the market. To do business, you have to work with them, and they made use of their control of the market to impose a certain restriction, certain conditions on the trade. So this, of course, according to Sukarno, this prevented the newly independent countries from doing well. And it affected Malaysia also. Although Malaysia did not have the Dutch system of getting the locals to produce sugar and all that, and part of the product goes to the Dutch. But in Malaysia, it's not so. It's the land in Malaysia that is taken over by the British. They set up big estates. They were making money. They were mining for tin, and all the business accrued to them.
Yeah. And then you said, let's stop looking at the West. Let's start looking around us, right? Yeah. And start focusing on that to get rid of them. But how did that went? Because that's not so easy, maybe.
But even before I became Prime Minister, before I became Member of Parliament, I visited Hong Kong, I visited Japan, and I also visited Europe. And I noticed that these countries were all prosperous. And I asked myself, why are they prosperous and we are not prosperous? So we studied the Eastern countries in particular, Japan, Korea, and later on China, Taiwan, and we find that they were doing the business that before was controlled by British companies. Jardine Matheson and all that were big British companies, but the Chinese were able to buy up all the business. In Malaysia, they were able to buy up all the estates. So the British monopoly in big business was broken largely by the Chinese, by the Eastern people. The Japanese, of course, went into manufacturing. They were able to produce whatever the European countries can produce, and they can produce all those things at a cheaper price. And the yen at that time was very cheap. So they were able to compete with European products, and actually they dominated the market. That was when the Japanese were forced to revalue their currency. That is they call that agreement. For the Japanese, that was an attempt to make their products more expensive. In fact, the yen became 3 times value in terms of 3 times more. So all the Japanese product, the price went up. But even when the price went up, the Japanese were able to organize themselves so that they can still compete and dominate the market.
So you wanted that for Malaysia as well. Understandably, you wanted that to happen here. How was the reaction from the Western world, let's say, from the big economists on your actions? Because maybe they didn't like it so much, I can imagine.
Well, they didn't quite like my policy, but I retained a relation with the West, because for some things we still had to get from the West. But many of the products now come from the East. So this eventually all European products were ousted from the market. It was replaced by Japanese products, by Korean products, and later on, of course, by Chinese products. So this did not make Europe happy with the market. But they still, to a certain extent, they control the market through the finance. So they can make you less competitive simply by changing the interest rate of the banks and revaluing your money. So
that's what they're still doing, maybe. Yeah. And then, because you already mentioned Sukarno, but there were later also many other leaders like Gaddafi in Libya who tried also to do something different, not to protect the resources and the wealth of their own country, but they were taken away. How did you never fear anything like that, or did you never maybe face some opposition that they were threatening you, or they were saying that you have to stop this, or something like that?
Well, they accuse us of having a very authoritarian government, not being democratic. We do not practice human rights and all that. So they attack on the social side. They couldn't attack on the economic side or on the political side. So they tried to make out that we were authoritarian countries which do not obey the rule of law. A lot of things were said about us to give a picture that we are prosperous because we do not practice democracy. You see, so that is there. But despite all that, we still managed to prosper, because although Europe was before the biggest market for Malaysia, slowly the eastern countries became bigger market. It came to a point where when China began to open up, China became the biggest market for Malaysian produce. So the influence, the ability of European countries to apply pressure was reduced.
Okay, yeah, and do you see that? So it's such a long history. We already started in 1500, right? This interview. Do you see, because a lot of people are talking about a multipolar world, about new powers coming up, do you think that the old empire already collapsed, or do you think that it is still happening or not yet? What is your view on that?
Yeah. After World War II, the concept of empires belonging to European countries was rejected. So European countries found they couldn't sustain their empires because it was becoming very costly. They had fought a war and they lost a lot of money through the war. So they decided to discard their empire. But if they lose their empire, they lose their source of income. So what do? They control the market, they control the finances. They determine, for example, the value of the currencies through Bretton Woods and all that. All these things were used by the Europeans to prevent the Eastern countries from taking over the market. So, although we produce the rubber, we produce the tin, and even products, manufactured products, the market is controlled by them.
Yeah, so they became smarter. It's indirecter, but they became smarter. But do you see change in that regard by that now China is being much more powerful? Is there change, or are we still, in the same old...
Yeah, when they lost their empire, they lost their market. For example, the British had a system called imperial preference, where if you buy British goods, you get some tax advantages. But after they lost their empire, they couldn't apply this. But what they did was they promoted the idea of a borderless world, that you should not use your border to stop goods from entering. They were hoping that if it is borderless, then they have access to the market they had lost. But still, they couldn't compete with the Eastern countries. But this idea of a borderless world was promoted by them and accepted by the whole world.
Because it sounds good, like free trade. It sounds good, but
it sounds good.
But maybe because I don't know how much time we still have, but there is also an aspect that they always use any means necessary when they cannot get what they want. So they use this regulation. Yes, they have the ICG, but as you also opposed the Iraq war, you also said but this is not the way to. Can you maybe explain how you, because that sounds quite radical, to set up a tribunal here in Malaysia, and later even you convicted men like Tony Blair and George Bush. I mean, that's quite radical.
That came later. But firstly, because there was a borderless world, we also have access to market. Now that is not something that the European countries like. So they claim that we were using child labor, slave labor, all kinds of accusations were hurled at us, and they boycotted our products. That is how they gain access through a borderless world, but when we gain access, they put in other barriers. But later on, we find that they were supposed to be promoting democracy. All the countries must be democratic. If you are not democratic, they are prepared to even invade your country and force you to become democratic, including getting rid of your leaders. This is what happened to Iraq. And then they promoted the idea of regime change. All governments of newly independent countries must become democratic. And when they became democratic, of course, lots of people will be struggling to gain power, and the countries became no longer stable. This is what has happened to many Arab countries. But
who believes that they were really, doing this because of democracy? We all know now that it's because of oil, right, and because of many other things.
It was worse than that. Actually, this goes back to the period immediately after World War II. Now, during World War, they worked with the Russian. But the moment they won the war against Germany, they said the new enemy is Russia. That was their partner. So if the new enemy is Russia, they have to have a defense organization. And then they created NATO. NATO is a military partnership in which Russia was not allowed, not invited. It was directed against Russia. And because Russia later responded with the Warsaw Pact to counter, and there was the Cold War between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. And this went on, and then finally Russia collapsed. And when Russia collapsed, many of the countries which were in the Russian Federation, the USSR, many of the countries were free. The moment they were free, the moment the Warsaw Pact was dismantled, actually it should lead to NATO also being dismantled. But no, NATO sees an opportunity to apply more pressure against Russia by getting those countries, the Warsaw Pact countries, to join NATO against Russia. And this is what happened. And of course, Russia feels threatened. So when Ukraine was invited to join NATO, Russia felt that this is a direct threat to Russia. But NATO was very smart. They don't allow Ukraine to join NATO first. They only say you can join. So Russia anticipated that and attacked Ukraine. So when Ukraine was attacked, it was not a member of NATO. If it is not a member of NATO, then NATO need not fight together with Ukraine. So now Ukraine is the battlefield. The people of Ukraine are dying, and millions of their people are now running away, and the whole country is devastated by the war. But the other countries are not affected. But they want Ukraine to keep on fighting against Russia.
And was that the same with all these wars in Arab, like Iraq? Is that the same old trick?
Yeah. They promote war because among the biggest arms producers, the biggest traders in arms was America. They had, if you make new weapons, there is no war. What are you going to do with the weapons?
So you say it's not only that they were after the oil, they were also, keep their market going.
They provoke confrontations. There is a war, and when there is a war, they can sell their weapons. Even Taiwan, for example. Taiwan and China. China says Taiwan is a part of China. Taiwan says we are independent. But although there seemed to be a clash between them, but they were working together. Taiwan invested huge sums of money in China. And Taiwan regards China as a big market for Taiwanese product. China, on the other hand, accepts these investments from Taiwan. It's beneficial to China. So they want that to continue. They also get technology from Taiwan. So although they say they are different, but actually there is no war between them.
But for the West, it is beneficial that they say that there is division and conflict. They use that. They use that to. But you say it's not.
Doesn't like a peaceful situation.
Yeah.
Because you cannot sell weapons.
Yeah.
So this Pelosky, what is her name? This speaker of this lady decided to go to Taiwan. What for? Why do you go to Taiwan? He went to Taiwan to provoke China.
Yeah, that's what you think. But too close, maybe. Can you give some comment? What was the reaction? Because I still think this act of creating the War Crimes Tribunal is a right one to challenge their morality and their legal responsibility. Was there any reaction from the West, even maybe by the press or by the ICG? Did they respond to you, to this action of resistance, I would say?
Well, they regarded this as non-starter because they dismiss our court completely. But we know that the wars, especially against Iraq, was provoked by America because they claim that because Saddam Hussein was a dictator, they need to change the regime. That is not their business. Any country can have whatever regime they can, but they said that, we have to make Iraq a democracy. And so they attack Iraq. They claim that within 3 months their attack would succeed and Saddam would be overthrown. But as you know, it went on until now. It's still not stable. They still have to keep soldiers in Iraq.
Yeah. So then, what was the response? Did they respond? Did there come any response?
When they do this, the main thing is that when there is tension, there is war, there is business. You see, and in that wars, you can sell weapons. Without wars, you cannot sell weapons. They keep on doing things to make confrontation between East and West burst out into actual war. And in war, they can make money. Because the main thing is to make money. Because they are the biggest producers of weapons, sophisticated weapons, very expensive.
And what is your hope? I mean, you have almost lived a century. Is there any hope? Do you see that this will change? Will this empire end? What do you think?
Well, my hope is in the young people. The young people, the university students, for example, see the wrong things being done by their own government, and they are demonstrating. One day, these young people will determine who will rule the country. Because in the democratic system, the young people, when they reach a certain age, they are eligible to vote and choose the government. I hope that the young people have learned the lesson and that they will not continue the aggressiveness of their own government. We are seeing for the first time young people are against their government. They are demonstrating.
But in Vietnam War, there were also many students going on.
The Vietnam War was also the same, because the people in America, the young people who will be recruited to fight the war and to die in the war, they find that there is no benefit in fighting against Vietnam. So the demonstration they carried out ended up with America losing the war and having to pull out from Vietnam. Now it is hoped that now the action of Israel will be stopped if America does not support Israel. Israel is able to do all these things even against the ICJ because America is behind it.
Yeah, let's hope that for the future. I want to thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Media Mondo.